One of the most remarkable aspects of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is its unique history. Throughout the world, great stories from faithful church members have only added to that history. This program shares some of these incredible stories of faith, perseverance, hope, and inspiration. You're listening to Legacy. I'm your host, Nathan Wright. Joining us today on Legacy to discuss the legend and the man are co-authors John W. Rockwell and Jerry Barrowman of the recently published book Stories from the Life of Porter Rockwell. John and Jerry, welcome to the Mormon Channel.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I'd like to get to know both of you a little better. Please take a moment and tell us about yourselves. John, why don't you go first?
I was born and raised in Lehi, Utah. Still live there. I attended public schools there. I served a mission in Mexico in the late 1960s. Graduate of BYU, and for the past 37 years, I've taught either history or Spanish in the public school systems. Very good. Thank you. Jerry?
I grew up in Pocatello, Idaho, served a mission in Dallas, Texas. That's a long time ago now, 1972 to 1974. Probably best known for being a writer in the LDS community. I wrote a book called Three Against Hitler with Rudy Wabi, a book with Joseph Banks, A Distant Prayer, and then a series of fictional books set in World War I and World War II. I was invited in on this project to help John take all the great stories he's collected throughout his life. He's a great-great-grandson of Porter Rockwell. And John had the stories, and I had the experience in co-authoring books. And so that's how I came to be part of the project.
Is there anything more to this partnership for Orrin Porter Rockwell?
Well, we didn't know it at the time. I certainly didn't know it. But my brother Wayne is sort of our family historian. And as I talked with Wayne and said, I'm helping John write this book, he says, well, you know that David Norton and Porter Rockwell were co-conspirators, you might say. I said, no, tell me about it. David Norton is my great-great-great-grandfather. And the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor, which was a newspaper in Nauvoo, anti-Mormon, anti-Joseph Smith, as mayor of the city, Joseph Smith ordered its destruction because it was defamatory. And it was Porter Rockwell who kicked in the door, and it was David Norton who set fire to the type. And so indirectly, those two men started the chain of events that led to the martyrdom of Joseph Smith. Later on, they both settled in Lehi. Wiley Norton, David Norton's son, was a deputy marshal, and so it's inevitable that he would have interacted with Porter. So the two families 100 years ago were together, and now John and I have had this experience.
And it's great to do this. This project is something I've had in mind for a good number of years, and with the good talents of Jerry, we've been able to put this together and present it to the public, and we do hope that they enjoy the great stories that are in the book.
Thank you. As you're a great-great-grandson of Orrin Porter Rockwell, and of course you just explained your association with the family, Jerry. How did you remain impartial while you're writing a book like this, or did you even try?
What I've tried to do in all the years that I've given firesides about Porter, that's been about 30 years I've been doing this, throughout Utah, other states, even in Canada, I am as impartial as a family member can be, in that I want the stories to tell about Porter, not my version of what I think Porter was like. Let the stories just define him and tell his story. And so even though, I do have biases, I'm a descendant, and I even named my oldest son Orrin Porter. But, you let Porter's stories tell themselves, what he was like without my input.
I think it's important to say that the stories that John refers to are accounts written at the time by people who knew Porter Rockwell. He was illiterate, so he never wrote a word about himself. He was also, from what I can gather, a fairly austere man. He never explained himself. He acted with confidence. He was a deputy marshal. Most often he was acting in that role as he brought criminals to justice, or he was defending himself from the people who would attempt to shoot him. As a well-known figure in the West, gunslingers who wanted to make their reputation, maybe we'll have time to talk about the special blessing Porter received from Joseph Smith, that promised to protect his life. But if you could be the guy who could shoot the man who could not be killed, think of what that would do for your reputation. So Porter would be going around the corner on his horse, and here'd be a gunslinger challenging him to a fight. So most of the times that he was involved in violence was either as a marshal or in defense of his own life. And people wrote about those stories when they heard them or when they saw them, and those are the kind of stories that John tells.
So these stories written by other people be considered primary sources as...
Yes, they are primary sources. There is a great deal written about Porter in the history of the church and the official histories of the church. He is a constant character throughout many of the great events of church history, beginning with the New York period where he and the young prophet Joseph were childhood friends. Then on to Kirtland, to Jackson County, to far west, then to Nauvoo. And at the death of the prophet and his brother Hiram, Porter chose to stay with the main body of the church, which tells you that even though he was loyal to the Smith family, to Joseph Smith in particular, he understood the priesthood authority would lie with the 12 and continue through Brigham Young. And he became the scout and hunter for the first party of pioneers coming west.
Thank you. That gives us a great starting point here. Let's go back. Those not familiar with Porter Rockwell's life may be surprised just how his early association with the prophet Joseph started. Will you help us out on his childhood and how it all happened? Well,
the Rockwell family were from Massachusetts, but after a few summers of crop failures due to the final throes of the Little Ice Age and summers without a summer, where ice would freeze on the ponds and the lakes, the Rockwells, just like the Smith, they had to go where they would be more prosperous. And in 1817, the Rockwell family sold their farm and moved to upstate New York, just north of Manchester, between Manchester and Palmyra. And the Smith family would eventually move into the same neighborhood, and the Rockwell farm and the Smith farms were adjacent to each other. Their homes were a mile apart. Typical on the frontier settlements, being that close of neighbors, they would have become good friends, and they did. But what is more important is that the young prophet Joseph and Porter, who was nearly 8 years younger than Joseph, they became childhood friends, and there is an event in their early lives that drew the two boys close together. We know the story of the prophet having his leg operated on, and what a dramatic story and experience that would have been for him and his family. But what we're not usually told is that it left the prophet with a distinct limp. In fact, when you moved into a new area on the frontier or anywhere within the United States, as an adult male, you were expected within a certain number of days to register to be a member of the local militia. And the prophet's limp kept him out of the militia because he was not physically fit to be a member of the militia. Porter suffered a similar mishap when he was a young boy, broke his leg, and a backwoods doctor set it incorrectly, and when it mended, it was shorter than the other. And he too would walk with a limp. But that common physical defect drew the two boys into a bond of friendship in their youth that would last a lifetime, if I would dare say longer.
I think it's important. So here's Porter. He was 7 at the time, and Joseph was?
I think he would have been 7 years old or 14, almost 14.
So 14 years old. So in many ways, it was like a little brother to a big brother. And the story that John's alluding to is Joseph Smith later in life would say that he did certain things in his youth that he was sort of rash. What we understand that to be is that if Joseph came across boys taunting or picking on little Porter, he would defend this little boy. And for that, Porter had this great loyalty to him. And it was interesting that in later life, Porter became the bodyguard of Joseph Smith, the official person designed to protect his life. And so from this, one of the things that interests me about this is that Porter Rockwell knew Joseph Smith before the first vision. So before any of the church was in being, and he was one of the first to hear in the Smith home all these marvelous stories of the restoration. Think about hearing from a boy about being visited by the Father and the Son, about seeing angels, about getting the gold plates. And so Porter Rockwell was actually in the church history from the very first day of the church. When he died, he was the longest living member of the church. So he was witness to virtually all the events of the first 50 years of church history, and that's why he's such a significant person in the history of the church.
And since they were friends and he had a great respect for this older brother figure, it wasn't that difficult for him probably to believe the stories and want to be a part of it. That's what it sounds like to me. There's
one story that is related where Joseph is visiting the Rockwell home. His prophet's parents are with him, probably some of his brothers and sisters, and he's telling the Rockwell family about what he has experienced and what he's learning from divine messengers. And it became late in the evening, and Mother Rockwell decided to send the children to bed, and Porter protested. Being the oldest child, he protested and said, "But let me stay up a while longer, just to keep the pine torch lit, their only source of light, so I can listen to the prophet Joseph." And I hope she let him stay up a little longer.
Later, he'd actually go to work. Here's a little boy. He'd do work, and he'd contribute whatever pennies he earned to the publishing of the Book of Mormon, even though he was not able to read it. And yet he believed in this, and so I think that's very substantial.
So the Porters and the Smiths remained close even after they left Palmyra. Is that right?
That is true. Porter, with the Smith family, he was a devoted follower of the prophet. The prophet once wrote about Porter while he was imprisoned for the crime of allegedly shooting Governor Boggs of Missouri. The prophet would write in his diary, "And call Porter a noble boy, and my heart dearly loves him." What the prophet was referring to was Porter's loyalty. That is one characteristic of a friend that the prophet admired the most, was their loyalty towards him. And Porter's loyalty to the prophet was tempted, tried, but he never failed in that loyalty to the prophet. In the Nauvoo period, he was almost a daily visitor to the Smith home. He would get there early, begin the fires, take care of the animals. He did this out of devotion to and love for the prophet Joseph and his family.
So the Porters not only followed them to Kirtland, but experienced all the hardships of Missouri as well.
In Jackson County, the Rockwells were the first group that settled there. They endured the persecution. The Rockwell home, his parents' home, was destroyed by mobs. Porter had recently married, and another mob destroyed his home, and there his young bride sitting on the rubble of their honeymoon cottage, if you wish. And Porter arrives. He was absent when the mob came. He arrives the next day and sees his young bride sitting on the rubble at home in tears. You can imagine the emotion you would feel seeing your young bride being treated that way, your home being destroyed in that manner. And from that point on, Porter promised that he would never be driven out and that he would never go unarmed, that he would protect not only his family, but in the bigger sense, he became a protector of the church as a whole.
So he wasn't always a bodyguard and a lawman. These are the events that apparently put him in that position.
These are the events that define in his early life his character as a young man. The persecution in Jackson County, having to, in the dead of winter, take your family as best you can, cross the Missouri into safer climes, and begin again in far west. And then to go through the Mormon War and the experiences of the extermination order issued by Governor Boggs, the siege of far west, the surrender of the prophet and his brother to the military in Missouri, and the fear of having the prophet imprisoned at Liberty Jail, and the fear of his pending death, execution most likely. Porter was almost a daily visitor to the jail in Liberty as a messenger between Brigham and Joseph, so that he could, from his jail cell, the prophet through Porter could still manage the affairs of the church and at least keep up on the news of how the Exodus was going. But it's in that environment that a very interesting story occurs that the prophet relates in his own diary. He wanted to escape. There was an attempted jail escape during a time when visitors were there, and the men with the prophet tried to bolt through the door, the jail door, but the jailer shut it in time. And in fact, the prophet even said that the jailer didn't blame them for trying to escape. But he asked Porter to bring in tools to attempt a jailbreak. Now, the inside walls of their dungeon cell were squared logs, very thick, then a large gap of stone rubble, then the outside wall is dressed stone. And so Porter smuggled in hammers, chisels, and an auger, a drill, hand drill. And when they got through the wood, which was easy, every stone they took out of the stone rubble, more would just keep coming down in their place. They finally got the exterior wall, but they broke the handle off of the auger trying to pry the stone loose. And so Porter was asked to smuggle in a new handle for the auger. And the prophet cryptically describes this in his diary, that a friend, just calls him a friend, doesn't tell who it was, but it was Porter, being a bit nervous, gave us away, and the jailer discovered that Porter was bringing in a new handle for the auger. And so that foiled the jailbreak. But the prophet also wrote, referring to the hole that they had breached into the jail wall, and he said to the effect, it was a fine hole. It'll cost the county around some to repair it, and for that I'm glad, even though they didn't get to escape. But escape they would eventually.
Porter wasn't always a good shot. It was the Missouri events that, as you say, made him decide to always be armed. But he had to start somewhere. He
had to start somewhere, and he taught himself how to shoot. Acquiring pistol, rifle, he would practice for hours in the woods with both weapons so that he could better protect himself, his family, and his fellow church members, and to the point where he became a deadly shot. In fact, in the California period during the gold rush, he was there with the Apostle Amasa Lyman to collect the tithing from Sam Brannan. And Porter decided to try his hand at panning gold, but he soon realized you don't get rich standing knee-deep in the cold American river panning for gold. You get rich panning miners. And so he opened up a couple of hotels and a saloon, the Round Tent Saloon, and offered to the miners what they wanted. And he became quite wealthy doing this, but to augment his income, he would also hold shooting contests. And the mining camps of the frontier, shooting contests were a very popular sport. And you put up your amount of gold, and everybody else who wants to participate puts up their amount of gold, and it comes down to the last two, and Porter never lost.
It was his match, though, huh?
It was his match, but he never lost.
One of the things that I found interesting, John is an authority on American weaponry. He's uses handguns himself. But it was interesting to me that when you shoot with a pistol, you point. When you shoot with a rifle, you aim. I think it would be interesting to hear some about how he managed the weapons that he's so famous for.
Well, oddly enough, Porter, when it came to handguns, did not use a holster. He was in the habit of cutting the barrel off of his pistols to about 2.5, 3 inches. So he invents the snub-nose revolver, in essence. And he would carry them in his waistband or his coat pocket. He felt that holsters were awkward and clumsy, that he was faster out of his coat pocket or waistband with his pistols than the outlaws from their holsters, much to the surprise and usual demise of the outlaw.
In some cases, when there wasn't any time at all, he'd actually shoot through his coat.
Yeah.
So he just put his hands in his pocket, point, pull the trigger, and he would hit.
There was a California outlaw who had come up to Utah to kill Porter. The outlaw and his friends put up a wager among themselves. Whoever killed Porter, because this legend about he cannot be killed, that whoever killed him would win all the gold. Well, this outlaw waylaid Porter at the point of the mountain on the Utah County side, a place called Oak Hollow. And Porter's probably in his buckboard. Here comes the outlaw out from the bushes with his pistol in his hand. And the fatal mistake of telling Porter about the bet and how much fun he's going to have spending all that gold.
He started to monologue.
Yes, and you don't do that. And Porter, hands in the air, thinking, he's got me dead to rights, what do I do? Looked up to him and said, do you think you're going to kill a man without a cap on your gun, cap and ball revolver? Oldest trick in the book, and the guy dropped his eyes to look to make sure, and Porter threw his hand in his coat pocket where that stub-nosed Colt revolver was at and just pulled the trigger. And that was one more hole in his coat pocket that Mary Ann, his wife, would have to repair. And he put the body of the outlaw in the back of the wagon, brought it into Lehigh, and probably turned it over to your great-great-grandfather. And there was an inquest to decide, was this a lawful act on Porter's part or not? And the decision was that he acted in self-defense. This is something that many of his detractors fail to understand. is that when Porter did kill someone, quite often he would bring the body in and turn himself in and wait for the judgment of his fellow citizens.
You know, earlier you asked a question. You said, what kind of man was he? Why did you want to tell the story? Are you unbiased in the telling of this story? I have to say that when I got the call saying, would you help John Rockwell write a book about Porter Rockwell, I didn't know how I felt about that. And I told them, I said, I see him as sort of an ominous character. There's a lot of people who died at his hand, and I don't know if he's a hero or a villain. And they said, well, listen to John and see what you think. And so I stepped up to it. And from that, I gained a couple of insights. First of all, if I were in one of the wagon trains coming across the plains, having been driven out of our homes in Nauvoo, I would desperately want someone like Porter to be in that wagon train. Those were very violent times. You had Indians who would attack. You had hired assassins who were coming after Brigham Young. You had detractors of the church. Porter Rockwell was equal to all of those challenges. He could hunt for food. He could bring food in. He could scare off Indians. There's some great stories in the book that talk about that. But he also, I have come to believe, acted with integrity when it was time to take men's lives. And so it's so hard for us to try to step back into the kind of violence that existed then and to judge Porter from this distance. At any rate, as I got done with it, I came to feel that this is a man who loved Joseph Smith dearly. He was loyal to the church, and he acted to protect it. The Salt Lake Tribune at the time was very much then an anti-Mormon paper. It accused Porter of hundreds of murders, none of which he ever disclosed. As we go to book signings and that, people will come up, and most are just, people love him because he loved Joseph Smith so much. But there are those detractors who will come up and they'll say he was just a murderer or something to that effect. John has a pretty interesting response to that.
Well, I do. At one of the book signings, a very well-dressed elderly lady said to me, he was just a hitman for Joseph Smith. And I politely said, well, ma'am, why don't you read the book and find out if that's true or not, because it's not true. Oh, he was just a hitman for Joseph Smith. And I said, okay, so who did he kill? She can't answer that. And so that's my usual response. If you're going to say he killed 100, 200, I've heard 300 people in the name of the church. So who were they? And since the LDS people then were great journal writers, where is the journal that says Porter showed up at the farm today and shot Dad for being an apostate? Where is that story? It's not there. And yet he's accused of such things. There is one story that is written in 1934 by two authors of a book trying to chronicle all of Porter's killings for the church. It names the family, the husband, the wife, the children correctly. And he's allegedly supposed to be sent there by Brigham Young to kill the woman for her sins. And it goes into great detail how that happens in the book. But the truth is, the woman died 12 years after Porter had already died, and she had died in a carriage accident in a different town than the book explains. Unless Porter's coming back from the grave. So there's all these kinds of stories about Porter and being the destroying angel, the High Lord executioner for the church, and they're apocryphal. There's no truth in them. And what I've done in my research, and I'm grateful to the biographers of Porter who have fleshed out many of these stories, that in every case that I find where Porter has taken a life, it's in war, self-defense, defense of others, or in his role as a deputy marshal for Utah.
The number that you've come up with?
If you count the questionable ones, it's 24 to 26. If you leave out the questionable ones, it's about a dozen.
And by questionable, you mean where someone died and it was attributed to Porter? But
it's attributed to Porter, but there's no real evidence to prove that. Only accusations by anti-Mormon sources.
Knowing that this interview is coming, I just asked my family arbitrarily last night, so what do you know about Orrin Porter Rockwell? And one daughter says, who's that? And my wife said, he was an outlaw, right? And so it varies a lot, and people don't know a lot about him. And I think this is a great effort to bring it back around and really tell people who he was.
One of the things that's really interesting, years ago, I heard a talk by a historian who was talking about Brigham Young. He said, "We have allowed Brigham Young's critics to define him for us today." And so the portrait that I always had of Brigham Young is this stern fellow who gave orders and acted as in a very authoritarian way. He went on to say, the fact is the people at the time called him Brother Brigham. They loved him. And then when we taught, I was the high priest instructor during the time when we studied from the book that featured sayings from Brigham Young. He was this extraordinarily clever man who had this warm and engaging, and so everything that I had thought about him was really wrong. Well, I tell you that story because I think we have allowed Porter Rockwell's critics to define him in our time. And you need to remember that there were people who at the time wanted to extinguish the church. I mean, they seized church property. They sent the prophet to jail. And the people who use Porter Rockwell are really being critical of Brigham Young, in my opinion. They're using him as an excuse to criticize others. And so to me, it doesn't ring true. What we try to do in the book is we present what other people had to say. We let their statements stand on their own, but then we tell the stories that we have heard. So I hope it gives a fair balance, but certainly there will be some who say it's not.
No, Jerry makes an important point with this. Today, people aim at Porter, call him Brigham's destroying angel, executioner for the church. Why do they do that? To get at the church, to get at the church leadership, to attack Joseph Smith or Brigham Young. But they even did that during Porter's lifetime. While Porter was in jail, accused of shooting Boggs, and he was there for almost a full 10 months, the local sheriff came into the jail cell with him and offered Porter $2,000 in gold. That is a great sum of money at that time. And the sheriff tells Porter, Joe Smith is your friend. He'll do anything you say. You get him to come into Missouri so we can arrest him, and you can name any amount of money you want. And the good citizens of Missouri will raise it. And you can live with us, a free man. So what do you say? How do you get to Joseph Smith during this period of history? Through his friend Porter. But Porter refused to turn on his friend and refused the offer and said, I won't do it. I will not betray my friend. And so he spends more time in jail. And still there are attempts to get Porter to turn on the prophet, but he won't do it.
So he does spend time for this supposed attempted on Boggs' life.
Well, somebody did shoot Boggs.
Somebody shot him, but what put Porter in this position? Why was he even a suspect?
He was a suspect because he was there. His wife at the time was about to give birth to their one more member of their family, a child, but she wanted to be with family. Unfortunately, family were in Independence, and the Rockwells were living in Nauvoo. But she insisted, so Porter took her back, established her with family members, her Uncle Calvin Beebe, his wife, and so the child could be safely delivered there, which is kind of unusual because there had many good midwives in Nauvoo, but she insisted to be with family. And Porter took her back, a place where Porter had a price on his head. He took an alias, James Brown, and got a job working for a local farmer, taking care of his horses, training horses. And it is then that the governor is at home, former Governor Boggs, reading a newspaper. It's at night, it's raining outside, and a single shot breaks through the glass behind him, and he is hit 4 times with one shot from a pistol, because whoever had used the pistol put buckshot in it. And he was severely wounded. Doctors were called in. One of the doctors happened to be his own brother, and through the help of the doctors, his life was saved. But a local merchant shows up on the scene, and here's the local sheriff, and the crowds assemble, and it is this local merchant who finds the weapon that was used to shoot Boggs, turns it over to the sheriff, says, I found this here by the window in the mud. Then he goes on to tell the sheriff that the pistol was his. that a few days before there were slaves in his store, and they must have stolen the pistol and either used it or sold it to someone who shot Boggs. But then later he changed his story and said, well, that fellow training horses for this farmer, he was in my store that same day. He must have taken the pistol and used it to shoot Boggs, of course referring to Porter, which is odd. Why wasn't this man, this merchant, who was a competitor of Governor Boggs, investigated? It was his pistol. He conveniently finds it and turns it over to the sheriff. Now, did Porter steal the pistol? No. Porter had his own weapons. He would not have had to commit the crime of theft, risking getting caught doing that, and use it to shoot the former governor. Besides, it was a pepper box pistol, a very pathetic weapon to use in an attempted assassination. And whoever had loaded it had overcharged the cylinder with powder and buckshot, so it blew out of his hand, apparently. And Porter knew not to do that. Besides, you have a reliable Gentile eyewitness that placed Porter many, many miles outside of town at the time the crime took place. Porter never confessed to this crime. There are those who claimed he did, but he did not. He never confessed to this crime. And in more modern times, here in Utah, there's an author who wrote about Colonel Patrick Connor at Fort Douglas, and this author makes the claim that Connor admitted that Porter had confessed to him that he shot Boggs. But Porter never made that confession to anyone, not even to Connor.
The reason this is significant, of course, is that it was Governor Boggs who issued the extermination order. So there was a great deal of animosity between the Missourians and the Saints who had been driven to Nauvoo. When Porter was found in the neighborhood, people assumed that Joseph Smith had sent him there specifically to assassinate Boggs. And that's why this becomes a destroying angel sort of myth that has grown up around Porter. Porter actually spent 9 months in jail because of this attempted assassination, even though a grand jury failed to bring charges against him, and the grand jury was made up of Missouri citizens who were not at all favorable to the church. It was when he finally managed to get out of prison, he had to make this tortuous walk across the entire state of Missouri in the dead of winter. And this leads to, we've alluded to, but it's really important that we talk about the blessing that Porter received at Joseph Smith's hand, because I think that's the defining moment for why the people who love Porter have such great affection for him.
So tell us about the night that he shows up in Nauvoo, having made his way all the way from Missouri.
Well, before I do, it is John C. Bennett, the apostate, who first makes the accusation that Porter is the one who shot Boggs. And Porter would confront Bennett with this, and Bennett admitted to Porter that he did not know for sure that he shot Boggs. And Porter made sure that Bennett stopped making the accusation. But, Porter, when he was finally released from jail in Independence, his mother was with him. They were making their way in the dead of winter across Missouri, walking. They had very little money. And here comes a mob. He'd been warned by his lawyer, Alexander Donovan, that a mob was planning on killing him. They hid in the snow-covered bushes so that the mob wouldn't see them, made their way to a friendly farmhouse, spent the night, and Porter gave what little money he had left over to his mother and told her, take a coach. It's not safe to walk with me. And so Mother Rockwell goes by herself, and in 11 days, Porter traverses the state of Missouri on foot and arrives in Nauvoo on Christmas Day. His long black hair has grown even longer. His full beard, black in color, has grown to the middle of his chest from his months in jail. Nobody recognized him. And that night, the prophet was having a party at the mansion house. All of a sudden, there was a disturbance at the door. Someone was trying to crash the party. The prophet yelled to the guards, throw that drunken Missourian out. Everything negative to the church was Missourian, preferably a drunken one. But the guards could not throw the man out. And so the prophet, being a famous wrestler, took off his coat, walked over, grabbed the man's coat by the lapels and lifted him up, looking at those steel gray eyes of Porter, a big smile under the mustache, another practical joke that Porter played on the prophet. And the prophet embraced Porter, kissed him on the cheek, and sat him down to tell the story of his being captured and imprisoned in Independence. And he goes through his attempted jailbreaks. The food was terrible. The practical jokes he played on the citizens while in jail, and he did do that too. But the prophet was so moved by Porter's experiences that he placed his hands on Porter's shoulders and pronounced a blessing on him. And in that blessing, he said to him that as long as he was true and faithful to his covenants, his church, and his God, that no bullet or blade would ever harm him, meaning no man could kill him. As a token of this blessing, he was never to cut his hair or his beard. And that's why Porter kept his beard long and had long hair. Now, just like the biblical Samson, who had a Delilah, Porter would have his Delilah too. But we like Porter's Delilah. Her name was Agnes Smith, the widow of Don Carlos. In one of his trips to California, he encountered her, and she just recovered from typhoid fever. And all of her hair had fallen out. Having pity on this member of the Smith family, Porter did what he should not have done, according to this blessing. Went to a barber, had his hair cut, took the hair to a wig maker in San Francisco, and had a wig made for her. You can see Porter Rockwell knocking on some poor widow's door and offering to her his most prized possession, a wig made of his own hair that protected him. And he would go into hiding after that to wait till his hair grew back before he faced more outlaws in the West. But he believed in this story, in this promise, fully. The Indians in Utah believed in it. When Porter rode shotgun for Wells Fargo, and the Indians would come up on it and see that it was him, they left the stagecoach alone. They would not attack it because they understood the promise about his hair. Outlaws tried to disprove it to their demise. So that's the story of Porter and why he had long hair.
Cross between, as you say, Samson and maybe Macbeth, because not to be able to be killed by a man. Very, very interesting. One of the most poignant moments, I believe, between Porter and Joseph for me is the discussion on the Iowa side of the Mississippi. This is when Joseph is making plans to go west to help prepare the way for the saints.
The destruction of the Nauvoo expositor is what begins the events that lead up to what you're alluding to. The prophet realized that he was the focal point of the persecution against the church. And if he left, perhaps the mobs, the detractors from the church, the persecutors of the church would leave the church people alone. So his intent is to cross over to Iowa and eventually go west to find a new home, a new gathering place for the saints somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. It is Porter who is rowing the skiff across the Mississippi River with Hiram, Joseph, and the Apostle Willard Richards bailing, for the skiff was leaking leaking very badly, and they had to bail with their boots to keep the water out of the boat. They get to the Iowa side, and Porter is sent back to give a letter to Emma, explaining what the prophet is doing. And Porter goes back to give the letter to Emma and get provisions for their journey west. Emma writes a letter back to her husband and insists that a few other men, one was Reynolds Cahoon, accompany Porter back to visit the prophet and try to convince him to return to Nauvoo. Emma felt that if the prophet turned himself in, that they would be safe again, as they always have been in the past. But it would prove different. When they arrived there, it is Reynolds Cahoon who chides the prophet for being a coward, for abandoning the church. His famous response to that, "If my life is of no value to my friends, it's of no value to me." Porter remembers the letter from Emma and gives it to the prophet to read. Don't know what it says, but when he's through reading it, there are prominent men, an apostle, his brother Hiram, two prominent businessmen from Nauvoo, and Porter. Who did the prophet turn to for advice? To his friend, his childhood friend, Porter. He turned to Porter and said, "Porter, what should I do?" And Porter simply said to him, "Joseph, you're the oldest, and you know what's best. You make your bed, and I'll lie in it with you," expressing his loyalty and devotion to the prophet. The prophet turned to Hiram. It is Hiram who suggests they return, and like Emma suggested, that they face the charges against them, and God would once again protect them. The prophet knew better. As they're leaving to go down to the river and get in the boat to cross back over, Porter and Joseph are lagging behind, talking with his. I wish, what were they talking about? I'd like to have known. But from the river's edge, only as an older brother can do, Hiram shouts out, "Joseph, hurry along." The prophet stops, puts his hand on Porter's shoulder, and says, "Porter, why should I hurry? I'm going to my death." You can imagine how you would feel if you heard those words fall from the prophet's lips, if you're his friend from childhood. Porter offered to gather the saints together one last time to hear the prophet speak by starlight if necessary, but that wouldn't happen, unfortunately.
The next day it was interesting. Joseph has to go to Carthage to surrender himself along with Hiram. And, of course, Porter's his bodyguard, so Porter starts down the road with him. And as they get to the edge of town, Joseph turns to Porter and says, "I need you to go back to Nauvoo. I have some business for you to conduct." Well, naturally, he protested, "I'm your bodyguard. What do you mean send me back? I've got to be there with you." And he says, "No, I need you to go back." And so Porter turned, and he knows what Joseph is facing. I just try to imagine the torture that was for Porter to go back into town and let Joseph Smith go and face what he had to by himself. You can't help but speculate, how would Carthage have turned out differently had Porter Rockwell been there? Because the men were essentially unarmed when they went up in that prison. But Joseph understood what had to happen. He knew the course the church had to follow and the price that he would pay so that the church could survive.
The prophet knew Porter's character, that he often threw caution to the wind. And while the prophet is first in Carthage, begins a letter-writing campaign, asking for help from anyone who he thinks might be able to help him in this situation. But in this most desperate time of the prophet's life, he takes time to pen Porter a letter. And in that letter to Porter, which someone else had to read to him, he warns Porter that under no condition was he to come to Carthage. If he did, he would be killed. So now we know why, after leaving Nauvoo to go to Carthage, the prophet stopped and sent his childhood friend home. Apparently he knew that his friend Porter would have been killed with him in that jail cell, and that there were other things for Porter to do for the church.
Because, like you say, he would have gone out in a blaze of glory.
That's right.
But he would have gone out. So, as bad as Porter felt not being able to be there with his childhood friend, his best friend, as he said, he was able to get some revenge, as he called it.
Well, he promised himself that one day, somehow, he would avenge the blood of the prophet Joseph. It's a year later. There are now attacks again from the mobs. For about a year, there was some peace between the Illinoisans and the Mormons in Nauvoo. But the mob action began again, and Brigham calls Porter in to go out and get that night's victims of mob attacks and bring them into Nauvoo for safety. So he picks a friend whose name is Return Jackson, Redding, and they are out some distance from Nauvoo, resting their horses. Down the road comes a lone man on horseback, and the horse is just at a dead gallop. The man sees Porter, reins his horse to a sudden stop, jumps off the horse. It is the local sheriff, Jacob Beckenstos, and he's not a Mormon, and he deputizes Porter on the spot and says, "You've got to protect me. The Carthage Greys are out to get me." Now, the Carthage Greys were the ones who were to guard the prophet at this jail cell in Carthage the day of the assassination. But when the mob came to commit their crime, the Carthage Greys fired their guns in the air and ran, let the mob do this. And Porter knew who the leader of the Carthage Greys was. His name was Frank Worrell. And Porter turned to the sheriff and says, "Don't worry, I have rifle and pistols and 72 rounds of ammunition." And Porter stepped out with his rifle, took a careful aim at the first member of this group of horsemen, the Carthage Greys, coming over the crest of the hill. He knew it was Frank Worrell. He aimed at his silver belt buckle, touched the trigger, and Frank Worrell went backwards off of his horse, a dead man. A local farmer ran up and said, "What's going on?" And Porter says, "I killed him." "Killed who?" "Frank Worrell." It was a far piece, didn't think it'd reach him. Porter got back on his horse and rode back to Nauvoo, in his mind satisfied that he had avenged the blood of Joseph. Why? What was Porter's personal calling from the prophet? To be his bodyguard. What was the responsibility of Frank Worrell? To guard the prophet in that jail cell. But he failed in his duty, and apparently was a was complicit in this crime of killing the prophet in Hiram. And Porter knew that. And a few years later, Porter would be tried in a court for shooting Frank Worrell, but he was acquitted by an Illinois jury, and the verdict was, according to the jury, self-defense.
He was a deputy, after all.
He was right then, because he'd just been
Right.
deputized. And
Right.
so it was self-defense of this local sheriff, Beckenstos, who was being hunted down by the Carthage Greys, and they were going to kill him.
We're getting close on time, but let's talk quickly of the journey west and some of his later years.
In the journey west, Porter was asked by Brigham to be hunter, to hunt buffalo, antelope, in other words, to feed the wagon train, but also to be the scout. And so it is Porter who, in essence, scouts out the Mormon Trail. And there are lots of fun stories about Porter hunting buffalo and trying to retrieve stolen horses. In one case, he tried to disprove the old rumor on the frontier that you couldn't kill a buffalo by shooting it between the eyes. The hide and skull were too thick, so he and a friend were out hunting buffalo. The friend happened to be Henson Walker Jr., who is my wife's great-great-great-grandfather. But they were hunting buffalo together. They see the herd. Porter fires his pistol in the air to stampede the herd, drops the reins over his saddle horn, and guides the horse in and out of the stampeding buffalo by using his feet, and gets to the lead bull, passes the lead bull, pulls out his rifle, throws it over his shoulder, and from backwards shoots the buffalo right between the eyes. Little puff of dust comes up. Buffalo puts on all four brakes, stops and looks up at the man who just insulted him, and chased Porter all the way back to the wagon train, where the men in the wagon train shot and killed the buffalo, and they had meat that night. Home delivery, I guess.
I wish you guys could have been in here to see John. He was putting his figurative rifle over his shoulder, and he was throwing the reins down to the side as he tells the story. So.
A little animated. It's a fun story. Another time, Pawnee Indians stole about half a dozen horses. Horses are important. They're your life string. Without them, you risk losing your life. So Porter was asked by Brigham to go get a few men and return the horses. And he does. And he finds the Indians on foot, but they're begging for tobacco. They don't have horses. But all of a sudden, in this little confrontation, from the wash over there, here comes over a dozen Indians. Guess whose horses they're on? Stampeding towards Porter and the three men with him, shooting guns and arrows at them. What do you do? Porter, again, drops the reins over his saddle horn, pulls out two Colt revolvers, charges the Indians head on. The Indians scattered. They had a healthy respect for bravery. And any one man, especially with long flowing hair, who was going to attack them head on, was deserving of their respect and honor. And so they scattered, didn't get the horses back, but at least Porter got the three men with him back to the wagon train safely.
One of the things that I found to be very interesting, people see Porter primarily because of his skills as a gunman. But the fact is he was a very wealthy businessman. He carried the U.S. mail under contract with the U.S. government. He had livery services. He opened hotels. He had saloons. He owned a silver mine. He owned a great deal of property. For those who are familiar with Utah, he had a ranch that extended from the Tooele Valley clear down to the Little Sahara sand dunes. Some contemporaries wrote at the time that when he died, he was the wealthiest man in Utah. Now, we don't know if that's exactly true, but he was certainly one of the wealthiest men. So this is an extraordinarily capable human being, a man who had 17 children with 3 wives. They weren't polygamous, but he left each of them a substantial inheritance. So there's a lot more to Porter Rockwell than just these legends that survived from the time. One other thing that I found very interesting, Porter was actually a legend in his own time. In the East at the time, there were what we would call dime store novels, where there were these novels about the wild, wild West. And Porter was often a character that was featured in those, often unfavorably because he was one of the Mormons, but he had a reputation that extended even in his own day.
There were even articles about him in the popular magazines of the day, like Collier's magazine. But as Jerry said, he was a prominent businessman. He was a devoted husband and father. He loved to be at home with his wife and children. He was not a polygamist, though he did marry 3 times. His first wife divorced him. His second wife died in childbirth. She is the wife that I descend through, Mary Ann Neff, and his last wife, Christine Olson, outlived him. So he was never a polygamist. but he did have 17 children. Of the 17, 2 were adopted Indian children. And, of course, he was appointed a deputy marshal in Utah, and so we look at that part of his life here in Utah as the one who the local officials would call on to hunt down outlaws. Even as far away as Nevada, a prominent rancher there sent a telegram into Salt Lake asking for Porter's help in hunting down rustlers. And the newspaper of that town, after Porter had achieved his assignment, wrote and was very complimentary on the success of Mr. Rockwell's endeavors in ending the rustling of cattle in their area.
For me, there's the qualities of loyalty and courage, I guess, are some of the more obvious things that we can learn from Porter Rockwell. What else can our listeners take from his life?
What I take away from Porter Rockwell is he's a complex character. I don't have enough information to fully judge him. That's why God reserves judgment to his own hands. On balance, I know that he acted in what he believed to be the best interest of the church and the best interest of the leaders of the church. He never doubted this blessing that he could not be killed by knife or blade, and he lived worthy of going to the temple. He was a 70 in the church. And so he was a man who believed in that blessing. And, if you think about it, that gives him confidence that the rest of us wouldn't have. And just having the confidence to go into a very complex situation, he could bring order to it because he was blessed by a prophet. So I think he's a man that is worthy of some of the great feelings that members have expressed about his life.
Porter was asked by Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, the church as a whole, to do extraordinary things at a time where things were not ordinary. It was the settlement of the frontier, the settlement of the West, the settlement of Utah. What a grand accomplishment to be involved in those types of things. But in spite of that, there are, among many traits and attributes of Porter that I find admirable, there's one thing that always stands out for me more than anything else, and that was his loyalty to and devotion for the prophet Joseph. And in a time where the prophet was constantly harangued by his detractors within and without the church, even today, we still find those who still feel the need to be critics of the church. Porter stands out for me as a person of devotion and loyalty to the church, in particular to the prophet Joseph. And that is the type of characteristic that I would hope that we'd all try to cultivate in ourselves, that degree of loyalty and devotion.
John Rockwell and Jerry Borelman, thank you for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.